Picture this. You're driving through the remote countryside of Turkey. The sun is setting behind ancient mountains. You round a corner and see a village ahead, stone houses, a mosque, narrow streets. But something feels wrong, terribly wrong. There are no people, no sounds, no smoke rising from chimneys, no children playing, no dogs barking, just silence. You walk into the village square. Doors hang open. Personal belongings are scattered everywhere. It's as if everyone just vanished. But here's the chilling part. They didn't vanish mysteriously. They left intentionally. All of them, in a single night. Welcome to the story of Gecede, Boşalan, the village that emptied in one night. This isn't fiction. This isn't folklore. This is a real phenomenon that has happened across Turkey, and the reasons behind it will shock you. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about community, survival, and the hidden forces that shape our lives. What makes an entire community decide, collectively, to abandon everything they've ever known? Their homes, their land, their ancestors' graves. What could be so powerful, so terrifying, or so compelling that hundreds of people would flee in the darkness, never to return? In Turkey, there are dozens of these ghost villages scattered across the countryside. Some were abandoned in the 1980s and 90s, others more recently. Each one tells a different story, but they all share one haunting characteristic: the speed of the departure. These weren't gradual migrations. These were mass exoduses that happened overnight. Today, we're diving deep into this phenomenon. We'll explore the real villages, the real people, and the real reasons that turn thriving communities into silent, empty shells. And I promise you, the truth is far more complex and disturbing than you might imagine. Let me tell you about the first time researchers stumbled upon one of these villages. It was in the Kurdish region of southeastern Turkey, near the Syrian border. A team of anthropologists was conducting field work in 2003 when their local guide mentioned a dead village just a few kilometers off the main road. They decided to investigate. What they found looked like a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. Houses stood intact, but empty. In one home, they found a table set for dinner. Plates, utensils, even dried-up food still visible. In another, children's toys lay scattered on the floor. A bicycle leaned against a wall, rusting. Laundry hung on lines, now tattered and faded by years of sun and rain. But the most disturbing discovery was the school. Inside, books were still on the desks. A chalkboard had lessons written on it, barely visible under years of dust. The date on the board read October 1993. The guide explained in a hushed voice. They left on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, no one was here. This wasn't an isolated incident. As the researchers continued their work, they discovered village after village with the same story. Some had populations of 50 people. Others had 500. But the pattern was always the same: rapid, total abandonment. To understand why these villages emptied, we need to go back to the 1980s and 90s, one of the darkest periods in modern Turkish history. This was the era of intense conflict between the Turkish military and the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. The Kurdish regions of southeastern Turkey became a war zone. But this wasn't a conventional war fought on battlefields. This was an asymmetric conflict fought in villages and mountains in the daily lives of ordinary people. The Turkish government implemented a strategy called village evacuation. The official reasoning was security. These remote villages could be used as supply bases or hiding spots for PKK fighters. If the villages were emptied, the logic went, the insurgents would lose their support network. But there's another, darker layer to this story. Many villagers were given an ultimatum: become village guards, armed civilian militias working for the government, or leave. Those who refused to take sides found themselves caught in an impossible situation. The military suspected them of supporting the PKK. The PKK suspected them of supporting the military. Trust evaporated. Fear became the only constant. Families received threats. Sometimes, soldiers would arrive at night and order everyone out within hours. Other times, the pressure was more subtle but equally devastating: blocked roads, restricted access to markets, Schools closed down, medical services withdrawn. One survivor, whose name I'll withhold for safety reasons, later recalled, "We weren't forced out with guns to our heads. We were strangled slowly. They made it impossible to live. No school for the children. No doctor in the village. No way to sell our crops. What choice did we have?" And so, in village after village, people made the agonizing decision. They packed what they could carry, gathered their children, and left under cover of darkness. Why at night? Because leaving during the day would make them visible targets. Night provided the only protection they had. But the conflict wasn't the only reason villages emptied. There's an economic dimension to this story that often gets overlooked. Turkey underwent massive modernization in the late 20th century. Cities grew, factories opened, job opportunities exploded in urban centers like Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir. Meanwhile, rural villages, especially in eastern Turkey, remained trapped in subsistence farming. Young people started leaving first. They went to cities for education, for work, for a different life. This is a global pattern, not unique to Turkey. But in the Kurdish regions, this natural rural-to-urban migration was accelerated and amplified by the conflict. With young people gone, villages aged rapidly. The remaining population, mostly elderly farmers, struggled to maintain agricultural production. Without youth, there was no one to innovate, no one to adapt to changing markets, no one to bring new energy. Add to this the lack of infrastructure. Many of these villages had no electricity until the 1980s. No running water, no paved roads. When the government withdrew services during the conflict, these villages weren't just isolated. They became unlivable. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a village of about 200 people in Sirnak province. The village had existed for over 300 years. Families had farmed the same land for generations. But by 1995, only 30 elderly people remained. The school had closed in 1990 because there were no children. The mosque fell into disrepair because there was no imam. Then came the final blow. The government cut off the water supply, claiming security concerns. Within a week, the last 30 residents loaded their belongings onto trucks and left. The village that had stood for 3 centuries was empty in 7 days. Now let's talk about what this experience did to people. Because the trauma of abandoning your home overnight isn't something you just get over. Psychologists who work with displaced villagers describe a unique form of grief. It's not like losing a loved one. It's like losing your entire identity, your home, your community, your purpose, your connection to ancestors, all severed in one night. Many displaced villagers ended up in Gecede, informal settlements on the outskirts of major cities. Imagine going from a village where you knew every person, every tree, every stone, to a sprawling urban slum where you're just another anonymous face, where you don't speak the dominant language fluently, where your skills, farming, animal husbandry, are worthless. Depression rates among displaced populations skyrocketed. Suicide rates increased. Alcoholism became a problem in communities where it had rarely existed before. Family structures collapsed under the strain. One woman who fled her village in 1994 described it this way: "We left our souls in that village. Our bodies came to Istanbul, but we're like ghosts here. I wake up every morning and for a moment, I forget where I am. Then I remember, and it's like the loss happens all over again." The children suffered particularly. Kids who were uprooted lost not just their homes, but their sense of continuity. Educational disruption was severe. Many dropped out of school entirely after the displacement. The literacy rate among this generation is significantly lower than their parents' generation. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough: the loss of language and culture. Many of these villages were the last places where ancient Kurdish dialects were spoken, where traditional songs, stories, and crafts were still practiced. When the villages emptied, all of that intangible cultural heritage, accumulated over centuries, was scattered to the wind. Some of it survived in the memories of survivors. Much of it was lost forever. So what happened to these empty villages? What do they look like now, decades later? Some have been completely reclaimed by nature. Roofs have collapsed. Walls have crumbled. Trees grow through windows. These villages are returning to the earth, slowly erasing all evidence of human habitation. Others have been repurposed. The Turkish military converted some into outposts. A few were resettled by different populations. Some have become informal tourist attractions, dark tourism destinations where curious travelers come to photograph the ruins and imagine stories. But here's what's really interesting. Some villages have been partially reclaimed by their original inhabitants. After the conflict intensity decreased in the 2000s, the Turkish government initiated a program called Return to Village. Displaced populations were encouraged, sometimes with financial incentives, to go back to their ancestral homes. The results have been mixed. Many people, especially younger generations, have no interest in returning. They've built new lives in cities. Their children were born urban. The village is just a story grandparents tell. But some elderly villagers did return, and their stories are both beautiful and heartbreaking. One man in his 70s went back to his village in 2008 after leaving in 1993. He found his house still standing, though damaged. He spent 2 years repairing it with his own hands. He replanted his father's orchard. He rebuilt the stone walls. But he lives there alone. His children visit once a year. His grandchildren think he's crazy for living in the middle of nowhere. He told an interviewer, "I came back because I couldn't die in the city. I needed to die in the place where I was born, where my father was born, where his father was born. Even if I'm alone here, I'm home." There's profound sadness in that, but also profound dignity. The story of Turkey's emptied villages isn't just a Turkish story. It's a global story, playing out in different forms across the world. Think about Syria, where entire towns were emptied during the Civil War. Think about Afghanistan, where decades of conflict displaced millions. Think about rural America, where small towns are dying as young people flee to cities, leaving behind aging populations and boarded-up main streets. The specific causes vary, but the pattern is the same. When the social and economic fabric of a community is torn, people leave. And once the exodus begins, it becomes self-perpetuating. Each family that leaves makes it harder for those who remain. Eventually, you reach a tipping point where the village simply can't sustain itself anymore. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of community and belonging in the modern world. Are we witnessing the end of small, traditional communities? Is urbanization an inevitable force that will eventually swallow all rural life? Or is there a way to preserve these communities while adapting to modern realities? Some researchers argue that what happened in Turkey was a preventable tragedy, that with different policies, these villages could have survived. Others see it as an inevitable result of historical forces beyond any individual's control. What's clear is that the loss isn't just about empty buildings. It's about the death of a way of life that existed for thousands of years. The villages that emptied overnight were the last links to an ancient world, a world where people lived their entire lives within a few kilometers of where they were born, where everyone knew everyone, where time moved the rhythm of seasons rather than clocks. There are aspects of this story that are difficult to talk about, but we need to address them. First, there's a question of atrocities. During the conflict, terrible things happened in some of these villages. Civilians were killed by both sides. Houses were burned. People disappeared. The Turkish government has been reluctant to fully acknowledge the extent of the violence. Many survivors are still afraid to speak openly. One particularly controversial topic is the alleged use of white phosphorus and other weapons in populated areas. While the Turkish government denies systematic abuses, human rights organizations have documented numerous incidents of disproportionate force. There are also accusations that some villages were deliberately destroyed after evacuation, not just emptied but bulldozed to prevent return. The government claims this was necessary to deny the PKK operational bases. Critics argue it was collective punishment of Kurdish civilians. The truth, as always, is complex and politically charged. Both sides in the conflict committed acts that would be considered war crimes by international standards. Both sides have narratives that paint themselves as victims and the other as aggressors. For the villagers caught in the middle, these political arguments were irrelevant. They just wanted to live in peace. They didn't care about ideology or national identity or any of the big ideas that politicians fought over. They cared about planting crops, raising children, and maintaining their communities. But they were given no choice. And that's perhaps the most tragic aspect of this entire story, the utter powerlessness of ordinary people in the face of forces beyond their control. Let me share some specific stories from people who lived through this. Ice was 19 when her village was evacuated in 1992. She was engaged to be married. The wedding was planned for following spring. But in November, soldiers arrived and gave the village 48 hours to evacuate. Her fiancé's family went to a different city. She lost contact with him. Years later, she married someone else, but she says she never stopped thinking about her first love and the life she might have had. Mehmet was a village elder, a respected leader who had mediated disputes for decades. When the order came to leave, he refused. He said, "I'm 70 years old. I've lived my whole life here. I'll die here." He stayed for 3 more years, alone in the village, tending his garden and his father's grave. Eventually, illness forced him to leave. He died in a hospital in Diyarbakir 6 months later. His family says he died of a broken heart. Zeynep was 12 when her family fled. She remembers packing by candlelight, her mother crying silently as she chose which possessions to take and which to leave behind. They left in a convoy of trucks at 2 a.m. As they drove away, Zeynep looked back and saw her village disappearing into the darkness. She never saw it again. She's 44 now, a mother herself, living in Ankara. She says, "I tell my children stories about the village, but they don't really understand. How can they? They've never known that kind of place, that kind of community. It's like describing colors to someone who was born blind." These individual stories, multiplied by thousands, represent an immeasurable loss, not just for the Kurdish people, but for human cultural diversity as a whole. So, what can we learn from the story of Turkey's emptied villages? First, that community is fragile. It seems solid and permanent when you're living in it, but it can be destroyed remarkably quickly. All it takes is the right combination of pressure, fear, and lack of economic opportunity. Second, that displacement isn't just a physical phenomenon. It's a psychological and cultural one. You can relocate people's bodies, but their sense of home, identity, and belonging doesn't transfer. That stays behind, haunting the empty spaces. Third, that conflicts of consequences that echo for generations. The children who were displaced are now parents themselves. Their trauma has been passed down. Their disconnection from their ancestral homeland has created a generation of people who exist between worlds, not fully accepted in the cities, unable to return to villages that no longer exist. But there's also resilience in these stories. Despite everything, Kurdish culture hasn't disappeared. It's adapted. It's found new forms of expression. The villages may be empty, but the people survived. They rebuilt. They found ways to pass on their language and traditions, even in hostile urban environments. Some scholars argue that the emptying of the villages, tragic as it was, inadvertently strengthened Kurdish political identity. When communities were dispersed to cities, they became more connected, more educated, more politically mobilized. The rural, isolated villager became the urban activist. The conflict that destroyed villages also transformed Kurdish society. Whether that's a positive outcome or simply making the best of tragedy is a matter of perspective. The villages are emptied in one-night stand as monuments to a particular moment in history. They're reminders of the human cost of conflict, of the fragility of community, and of the resilience of the human spirit. When you drive through rural Turkey today, you will pass dozens of these ghost villages. Most people don't notice them. They're just ruins on distant hillsides. But each one was a world, a complete universe of relationships, memories, traditions, and daily rituals. Each one was home to people who never imagined they would be refugees, who never thought they would be forced to start over in middle age. The story of Gecede Boşalan Koy isn't really about villages. It's about what happens when the social contract breaks down, when government and citizen, neighbor and neighbor, can no longer trust each other, when fear becomes stronger than the bonds that hold communities together. It's a warning in many ways. Because the forces that emptied these villages, conflict, economic pressure, government policy, demographic change, aren't unique to Turkey or that specific time period. They're active all over the world right now. Small communities everywhere are under pressure. The question is, will we learn from Turkey's example, or will we see more ghost villages emerge in the decades to come? As we close this story, I want to leave you a question to think about. What would it take to make you abandon your home overnight? What combination of circumstances would force you to leave everything behind? And once you left, could you ever truly go home again? These aren't hypothetical questions for the people who lived through this. For them, it's their reality, their history, their trauma. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it opened your eyes to a part of history you didn't know about, please hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the hidden stories, the forgotten histories, the human experiences that shape our world but rarely make the headlines. Drop a comment below telling me, have you ever heard of a similar story from another part of the world? Do you know of communities that were displaced overnight? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, remember, every empty building has a story. Every ghost town was once someone's home. And the people who live there deserve to be remembered. Thank you for listening.